The crimson tide of betrayal washed over the Caribbean as Captain Marcus Blackwood stood on the deck of his flagship, watching his own crew turn against him. For 3 decades, he had ruled the seas with an iron fist, commanding a fleet of 12 vessels and over 800 men. His name struck fear into merchant captains from Port Royal to Tortuga. But on this moonless night in 1692, everything he had built was crumbling around him. The mutiny had been brewing for weeks. Blackwood's recent obsession with a legendary treasure map had driven him to increasingly desperate measures. He had pushed his crew beyond their limits, sailing through hurricane-ravaged waters and attacking heavily fortified Spanish galleons with reckless abandon. When they finally found the buried chest on a remote island, it contained nothing but worthless trinkets and fool's gold. The crew's patience had finally snapped. As dawn broke over the horizon, Blackwood found himself bound with thick rope and dragged to the ship's rail. His first mate, Thomas Briggs, a man he had trusted like a brother for 15 years, stepped forward with a cruel smile. The crew had voted, and their captain's fate was sealed. They would not simply maroon him on some deserted beach or run him through with a cutlass. No, Blackwood deserved something far more creative for his betrayal of their trust. The pirates had devised a punishment that would become legend among seafaring men for generations. They attached heavy chains to Blackwood's ankles and secured the other end to the ship's anchor. The captain would be dragged beneath the waves, but not to a quick death by drowning. The chains were precisely measured to keep him just below the surface, allowing him occasional gasps of air as the ship rocked with the swells. For 3 agonizing hours, Blackwood was pulled through the churning waters. Salt water filled his lungs repeatedly as he fought desperately to reach the surface. Barnacles on the ship's hull tore at his flesh with each passing. His screams were muffled by the sea, audible only when his head briefly broke through the waves. The crew watched from above, some cheering, others growing silent as they witnessed their former captain's prolonged torment. When they finally hauled up the chains, Blackwood was still breathing, though barely. His body was a mass of cuts and bruises, his lungs filled with seawater. But the crew wasn't finished. They had one final humiliation planned for the man who had led them to ruin. Meanwhile, in the bustling port of Nassau in 1718, another pirate captain was about to discover that even the most cunning sea wolves could fall victim to their own schemes. Captain Eliza Redmont, one of the few female pirates to command her own ship, had built her reputation on elaborate cons and daring escapes. Her crew of 70 men followed her without question, drawn by her uncanny ability to outsmart both naval forces and rival pirates. Redmont's downfall began with what seemed like her greatest triumph. She had successfully infiltrated a wealthy merchant's mansion in Port Royal, posing as a Spanish noblewoman seeking passage to Europe. For 3 weeks, she gathered intelligence about incoming treasure ships while enjoying the finest wines and delicacies her host could provide. But her deception ran deeper than anyone suspected. Unknown to her crew, Redmont had been secretly negotiating with Governor Hamilton to betray her own men in exchange for a royal pardon and a substantial reward. She had grown tired of the constant danger and uncertainty of pirate life, dreaming instead of a comfortable retirement in London society. The merchant whose hospitality she had enjoyed was actually a government agent, and their entire relationship had been an elaborate trap. On the night she planned to signal the naval squadron waiting offshore, her quartermaster William Hayes discovered her treachery. He had grown suspicious of her extended absences and followed her to a clandestine meeting with British officers. The revelation struck the crew like a lightning bolt. Their beloved captain, the woman who had led them through countless battles and narrow escapes, had sold them out for 30 pieces of silver. The crew's rage was immediate and terrible. They seized Redmont before she could draw her pistol and dragged her back to their ship anchored in the harbor. What followed was a trial by combat, but not the honorable duel between equals that pirate codes typically demanded. Instead, they devised a punishment that would match the depth of her betrayal. Redmont was stripped of her captain's coat and forced into the ship's hold, where they had prepared a special chamber. The space was filled with dozens of hungry rats, creatures that had multiplied in the ship's dark corners during their long voyages. But the crew had added a cruel twist to this already horrific fate. They had covered Redmont's body with molasses and fish oil, substances that would drive the rodents into a feeding frenzy. As the hold was sealed above her, Redmont could hear the scratching and squeaking of countless claws and teeth approaching through the darkness. The sweet scent of molasses mixed with the putrid smell of rotting fish created an overwhelming stench that made breathing difficult. Within minutes, the first rats reached her, their sharp teeth tearing at the sticky coating on her skin. The screams that echoed from the ship's belly could be heard across the harbor, sending chills through even the most hardened sailors in nearby vessels. For 2 days, the crew left their former captain in that nightmarish prison, occasionally lowering a torch to observe her deteriorating condition. Her pleas for mercy fell on deaf ears, as the men she had planned to sacrifice showed her the same compassion she had intended for them. When they finally opened the hold, Redmont was barely recognizable. Her body bore hundreds of bite marks, some so deep that bone was visible through the torn flesh. The rats had consumed portions of her fingers and toes, leaving ragged stumps that still oozed blood. But she was still alive, her chest rising and falling in shallow, labored breaths. The crew had timed their torture perfectly, ensuring maximum suffering while keeping their victim conscious enough to experience every moment of agony. The final act of Redmont's execution took place on the ship's deck as the sun reached its peak. The crew had fashioned a crude operating table from wooden planks, where they secured their former captain with iron manacles. Without any medical training or proper instruments, they began systematically removing her internal organs while she remained conscious. Her screams pierced the tropical air as they extracted her liver, then her kidneys, tossing each organ into the sea for the sharks that had gathered below. The butchery continued for nearly an hour before Redmont finally succumbed to blood loss and shock. Her eyes remained open, staring sightlessly at the Caribbean sky she had once commanded. The crew threw her mutilated remains overboard, watching as the feeding frenzy below turned the crystal blue waters crimson red. Across the Caribbean, tales of another gruesome pirate death were already becoming legend. In 1721, Captain Josiah Grimm had earned his fearsome reputation through a combination of tactical brilliance and sadistic cruelty. His ship, the Bone Collector, was decorated with the skulls of his victims, and his crew of 90 men were known for their ritual torture of captured prisoners. Grimm believed that inflicting maximum terror would make future conquests easier, as merchant ships would surrender without resistance rather than face his legendary brutality. But Grimm's reign of terror came to an abrupt end when he made the fatal mistake of attacking a vessel carrying the daughter of a powerful Spanish admiral. The young woman, Isabella Valdez, was traveling to her wedding in Cartagena when Grimm's pirates seized her ship. What followed was 3 days of unspeakable torment as Grimm personally oversaw her torture, believing that breaking such a high-value prisoner would send a message throughout the Caribbean. When Admiral Valdez learned of his daughter's fate, he assembled a flotilla of 8 warships and began hunting Grimm with single-minded determination. The Spanish admiral had connections throughout the Caribbean, and soon every port from Havana to Barbados was offering substantial rewards for information about the Bone Collector's whereabouts. It took 6 months, but Valdez finally cornered Grimm's ship in a narrow inlet off the coast of Venezuela. The battle was swift and decisive. Grimm's pirates, facing overwhelming firepower and superior numbers, attempted to flee into the jungle-covered interior. But the Spanish forces had anticipated this strategy, landing Marines at every possible escape route. One by one, the pirates were captured or killed, until only Grimm himself remained hidden in a cave system deep within the tropical forest. When they finally dragged him from his hiding place, Admiral Valdez had prepared a special punishment that would match the cruelty Grimm had shown his daughter. The pirate captain was transported to Cartagena, where he was placed in the town square for public execution. But this would not be a quick death by hanging or firing squad. Instead, Valdez had commissioned local craftsmen to build a device specifically for Grimm's demise. The contraption resembled a wooden chair, but with horrific modifications. Sharp metal spikes protruded from every surface, positioned to pierce the victim's body at dozens of points without causing immediate death. The spikes were carefully placed to avoid vital organs, ensuring that Grimm would remain conscious throughout his ordeal. Leather straps secured his arms and legs, preventing any possibility of escape or even shifting position to reduce the agony. As thousands of spectators gathered to witness the execution, Grimm was slowly lowered onto the spiked chair. The metal points penetrated his flesh gradually, each one causing excruciating pain as it pushed deeper into muscle and tissue. His screams echoed across the plaza as blood began seeping from dozens of wounds simultaneously. The crowd cheered with each cry of anguish, remembering the countless innocent victims who had suffered under Grimm's cruelty. The torture continued for 8 hours as the sun blazed overhead. Valdez had positioned mirrors around the chair to focus the intense tropical heat on Grimm's bleeding body, adding dehydration and sunburn to his mounting torments. Flies swarmed around the open wounds, laying eggs in the torn flesh while the pirate captain remained helplessly restrained. These tales of maritime brutality serve as stark reminders that the golden age of piracy was far from the romanticized adventure stories we often imagine today. Captain Blackwood's underwater torment, Eliza Redmont's rat-infested nightmare, and Josiah Grimm's spiked chair execution reveal the harsh reality that awaited those who chose to live by the sword on the high seas. Each of these pirate leaders met their end through the very violence and betrayal they had spent their careers perfecting. The Caribbean waters that once carried these fearsome captains to glory became their final resting place, stained with the blood of both their victims and themselves. Their crews, the very men and women who had followed them into countless battles, ultimately became their executioners when trust dissolved into rage and revenge. These deaths were not just punishments, but messages carved in flesh and bone, warnings that echoed across every port and tavern where sailors gathered to share their darkest tales. In the end, the worst pirate deaths ever recorded show us that those who lived without mercy rarely found any when their time came. The sea, it seems, has a long memory for cruelty, and the tide of justice, though sometimes delayed, always finds its way to shore.